It's important to get to know about St. Mark, the evangelist who first put the gospel in writing. This 10-minute video, which is part one of a series, will help you to get familiar with Mark, who he was, when he wrote, what his main concerns were, and how he captured the eyewitness testimony of St. Peter. I'm Gene Vanderzanden, author of Mark's Passion, an interesting historical novel about St. Mark and his times. The majority of New Testament scholars today believe that Mark's Gospel was written first, between 64 and 69 AD. Matthew and Luke followed in the 80s, and John's Gospel came out in the 90s. This means that Mark's Gospel was first. He was the pioneer. So the more you learn about Mark, the more that everything else that you learn about the Gospels will make sense to you. We know virtually nothing about the Gospel writers. Mark, according to the best attested tradition, was an aide and interpreter for Peter during the time that Peter lived in Rome as the head of the church. Matthew had been thought to be Matthew the tax collector, one of the 12 apostles, but New Testament scholars today do not see this gospel writer as an eyewitness. Rather, they say he was a skilled communicator who drew upon the tradition about Jesus and put those stories in writing in the 80s AD. Luke, we know, was a physician who is mentioned in some of Paul's letters and may have traveled a bit with St. Paul. And John, we know more about than any of the others because he wrote in old age as an eyewitness and set down many accounts about Christ that the others had missed. He refers to himself in the Gospel as the disciple Jesus loved and was with Christ from the time of his baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. He probably traveled with Jesus through Galilee. John was present in Jerusalem at the Last Supper. He kept watch during the crucifixion with Mary and was with those who laid Jesus in the tomb and went to the tomb on Sunday morning after the women found it empty. So who was Mark? According to the best attested tradition, he was an aide and interpreter for Peter. Peter was a Galilean who spoke Aramaic at a time when the international language was Greek. Peter probably knew some Greek, maybe quite a bit of Greek, but as the head of a worldwide church, he needed someone at his side who could not only speak Greek fluently, but also read Greek and write Greek and help Peter communicate with those from other countries throughout the Roman Empire. He was not the John Mark mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, nor the Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, mentioned in Paul's letters. For centuries and centuries, people have confused these three Marks, even though Hippolytus of Rome, a Christian historian writing at the end of the 2nd century, attested that these Marks were three different persons. That didn't stop people from running them together, though, in an attempt to give the gospel writer more credibility, by blending these three Marks together to make one. And people today continue to repeat this confusion over and over, without looking into the facts from the 2nd century. And Mark may not even be the person whose remains are enshrined at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. Ever since the cathedral was built there have been rumors and intrigues questioning who is buried there. I don't know about that, it's not my field, but I thought you might like to know. Well, what were Mark's main concerns? Well, first of all, it was putting what was known about Jesus into a written narrative. If Peter or someone else had seen the need, it would have happened long before the mid-60s AD. Mark had the vision to see how a written story of Jesus would be important as time rolled on. That was his main concern. I've got to get the stories of Jesus in writing. Mark wanted to show that Jesus was the divine Son of God. This comes through in passage after passage of Mark's Gospel. We see it in the healings, we see it in the miracles, we see it in how he spoke. He spoke in the very person of the Father. And Mark wanted to demonstrate what authentic discipleship was like. He did this through examples, both good examples and bad examples of Christ's followers. For instance, when Peter and the other disciples were with Jesus near Caesarea Philippi, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This was a good example. But then later, in the courtyard of the high priest, on the night that Jesus was arrested, when the maidservant asked him, "You were with him, weren't you? For you are a Galilean," he denied even knowing Jesus. He denied him 3 times before the cock crowed. Scholars today believe that Mark may have had access to an earlier Passion document. They theorize this because the Passion story is one continuous narrative. It has a nice continuous flow from the agony in the garden through the crucifixion. It sounds like it was written by one person at what time. The stories of Jesus' public years, on the other hand, in chapters 1 through 12, are more chopped up. They are little episodes of things Jesus did from day to day that are strung together like beads on a string. This leads scholars to believe that the written Passion story may have pre-existed his gospel, even though no copies of it exist today. Who wrote the Passion document? We don't know. It may have been Mark working earlier. It may have been someone else. We don't know who wrote it. Mark also may have had access to another document listing some of the sayings of Jesus. Scholars believe his sayings may have been gathered into a saying source that also does not exist today. This text would have included sayings of Christ like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of God is theirs." And "How many times must I forgive? 7 times?" No, Jesus said, 70 times, 7 times. Those were accumulated, scholars believe, into an earlier document. Mark would have known about the sayings, but Mark chose, for his own reasons on what he wanted to emphasize, to focus more upon what Jesus did rather than on what Jesus said. We like to hear Matthew and Luke for including these sayings. They teach us a lot. But Mark wanted to emphasize what Jesus did. It's good that we have all of the various Gospels today. They're all useful, each in their own way. So does Mark's Gospel contain the eyewitness accounts of Peter? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. They are summaries of stories that Mark heard Peter tell as he spoke to the crowds and spoke to individuals, and Mark helped him translate them into Greek. They're strung together like pearls on a string. The stories about Jesus in chapters 1 through 12 are short accounts of what Jesus did in his public years, from his baptism in the Jordan River by John the Baptist up to the time of his Passion. The episodes are strung together like pearls on a string, but together they represent the eyewitness testimony of Peter. The accounts are not Pauline. They don't sound like St. Paul. They don't use Paul's terminology. They don't relate to the issues that Paul strove so hard to emphasize in his letters. Nope, they're not Pauline. And the stories of the gospel don't seem to originate from Mary, the mother of Jesus, nor from Mary Magdalene. These women are in the stories. They play an important role, but they are not central characters who say much about Jesus. It's a good idea to read all that you can about Mark. The more that you know about him, the more meaningful the Gospels will be for you. So watch the other videos in this series. You'll learn a lot more. To find them, go to our channel, Mark's Passion. You may want to read Mark's Passion, my historical novel about the adventures of Mark and the challenging times in which he lived. All of the historical events depicted in the book are factual, and it's an interesting way and an exciting way to learn more. And I recommend that you go to my website, markspassion.com, and look at the free articles and information you'll find there. Check out the easy-to-understand article, What New Testament Scholars Are Saying Today, and follow the links to the various study sources that we provide. So take a look at Mark's Passion. It's the electrifying story of a young man's quest for love and his passion for putting what was known about Jesus in writing. Click on the Amazon.com link below this video to go order my book, Mark's Passion. And thanks for watching.